The works of the Right Honorable Edmund Burke, first American from the last London edition, Volume 1, 1806. This is Volume 1. It starts with an advertisement to the reader and to the present edition. Starting on page 1, is a vindication of natural society, or a view of the miseries and evils arising to mankind from every species of artificial society. On page 53, a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and beautiful, with the introductory discourse concerning taste. Page 211, a short account of a late short administration. Page 217, observations on a late publication intituled The Present State of the Nation. Thoughts on the cause of the present discontents on page 349. Speech on American taxation, page 431. And the advertisement to the reader. The late Mr. Burke, from a principle of unaffected humility, which they, who were the most intimately acquainted with his character, best know to have been, in his estimation, one of the most important moral duties, never himself made any collection of the various publications with which, during a period of 40 years, he adorned and enriched the literature of this country. When, however, the rapid and unexampled demand for his Reflections on the Revolution of France had unequivocally testified his celebrity as a writer, some of his friends so far prevailed upon him that he permitted them to put forth a regular edition of his works. Accordingly, 3 volumes in quarto appeared under that title in 1792, printed for the late Mr. Dodsley. That edition, therefore, has been made the foundation of the present, for which a form has been chosen better adapted to public convenience. Such errors of the press as have been discovered in it are here rectified. In other respects, it is faithfully followed, except that, in one instance, an accident of little moment has occasioned a slight deviation from the strict chronological arrangement, and that, on the other hand, a speech of conspicuous excellence on his declining the pole at Bristol in 1780 is here, for the first time, inserted in its proper place. As the activity of the author's mind and the lively interest which he took in the welfare of his country ceased only with his life, many subsequent productions issued from his pen, which were received in a manner corresponding with his distinguished reputation. He wrote also various tracts of a less popular description, which he designed for private circulation in quarters where he supposed they might produce most benefit to the community, but which, with some other papers, have been printed since his death, from copies which he left behind him fairly transcribed, and most of them corrected as for the press. All these, now first collected together, form the contents of the last volume. They are disposed in chronological order with the exception of the preface to Brisset's address, which, having appeared in the author's lifetime, and from delicacy not being avowed by him, did not come within the plan of this edition, but has been placed at the end of the last volume, on its being found deficient in just bulk. The several posthumous publications, as they from time to time made their appearance, were accompanied by appropriate prefaces. These, however, as they were principally intended for temporary purposes, have been omitted. Some few explanations only, which they contain, seem here to be necessary. The observations on the conduct of the minority in the sessions of 1793 have been written and sent by Mr. Burke as a paper entirely and strictly confidential, but it crept surreptitiously into the world through the fraud and treachery of the man whom he had employed to transcribe it, and, as usually happens in such cases, came forth in a very mangled state, under a false title, and without the introductory letter. The friends of the author, without waiting to consult him, instantly obtained an injunction from the Court of Chancery to stop the sale. What he himself felt on receiving intelligence of the injury done to him by one, from whom his kindness deserved a very different return, will be best conveyed in his own words. The following is an extract of a letter to a friend, which he dictated on this subject from a sick bed. Bath, 15th February, 1797. My dear Lawrence, on the appearance of the advertisement, all newspapers and all letters have been kept back from me till this time. Miss Burke opened yours, and finding that all the measures in the power of Dr. King, yourself, and Mr. Woodford had been taken to suppress the publication, she ventured to deliver me the letters today, which were read to me in my bed about 2 o'clock. This affair does vex me, but I am not in a state of health at present to be deeply vexed at anything. Whenever this matter comes into discussion, I authorize you to contradict the infamous reports, which, I am informed, have been given out, that this paper had been circulated through the ministry, and was intended gradually to slide into the press. To the best of my recollection, I never had a clean copy of it but one, which is now in my possession. I never communicated that, but to the Duke of Portland, from whom I had it back again. But the Duke will set this matter to rights. If in reality there were 2 copies, and he has one, I never showed it, as they know, to any one of the ministry. If the Duke has really a copy, I believe his and mine are the only ones that exist, except what was taken by fraud, from loose and incorrect papers by S., name removed, to whom I gave the letter to copy, as soon as I began to suspect him capable of any such scandalous breach of trust. You know with what anxiety I got the loose papers out of his hands, not having reason to think that he kept any other. Neither do I believe, in fact, unless he meditated this villainy long ago, that he did or does now possess any clean copy. I never communicated that paper to anyone out of the very small circle of those private friends from whom I concealed nothing. But I beg you and my friends to be cautious how you let it be understood that I disclaim anything but the mere act and intention of publication. I do not retract any one of the sentiments contained in that memorial, which was and is my justification, addressed to the friends for whose use alone I intended it. Had I designed it for the public, I should have been more exact and full. It was written in a tone of indignation in consequence of the resolutions of the Whig Club, that's WHIG, which were directly pointed against myself and others, and occasioned our secession from that club, which is the last act of my life that I shall under any circumstances repent. Many temperaments and explanations there would have been, if I had ever had a notion that it should meet the public eye. In the meantime, a large impression and amounting, it is believed, to 3,000 copies, had been dispersed over the country. To recall these was impossible. To have expected that any acknowledged production of Mr. Burke, full of matter likely to interest the future historian, could remain forever in obscurity would have been folly, and to have passed it over in silent neglect on the one hand, or on the other to have then made any considerable changes in it, might have seemed an abandonment of the principles which it contained. The author therefore discovering that, with the exception of the introductory letter, he had not in fact kept any clean copy, as he had supposed, corrected one of the pamphlets with his own hand. From this, which was found preserved with his other papers, his friends afterwards thought in their duty to give an authentic edition. The Thoughts and Details on Scarcity were originally presented in the form of a memorial to Mr. Pitt. The author proposed afterwards to recast the same matter in a new shape. He even advertised the intended work under the title of Letters on Rural Economics addressed to Mr. Arthur Young, but he seems to have finished only 2 or 3 detached fragments of the first letter. These being too imperfect to be printed alone, his friends inserted them in the memorial where they seem best to cohere. The memorial had been fairly copied, but did not appear to have been examined or corrected, as some trifling errors of the transcriber were perceptible in it. The manuscript of the fragments was a rough draft from the author's own hand, much blotted and very confused. The third letter on the proposals for peace was in its progress through the press when Mr. Burke died. About one half of it was actually revised in print by himself, though not in the exact order of the pages as they now stand. He enlarged his first draft and separated one great member of his subject for the purpose of introducing some other matter between. The different parcels of manuscript designed to intervene were discovered. One of them he seemed to have gone over himself and to have improved and augmented. The other, fortunately the smaller, was much more imperfect, just as it was taken from his mouth by dictation. No important change, none at all affecting the meaning of any passage, has been made in either, though in the more imperfect parcel some latitude of discretion in subordinate points was necessarily used. There is, however, a considerable member, for the greater part of which Mr. Burke's reputation is not responsible. This is the inquiry into the condition of the higher classes. The summary of the whole topic, indeed, nearly as it stands, was found together with a marginal reference to the bankrupt list, in his own handwriting, and the actual conclusion of the letter was dictated by him, but never received his subsequent correction. He had also preserved, as materials for this branch of the subject, some scattered hints, documents, and parts of a correspondence on the state of the country. He was, however, prevented from working on them by the want of some authentic and official information, for which he had been long anxiously waiting, in order to ascertain, to the satisfaction of the public, what with his usual sagacity he had fully anticipated from his own personal observation to his own private conviction. At length, the reports of the different committees which had been appointed by the 2 houses of Parliament amply furnished him with evidence for this purpose. Accordingly, he read and considered them with attention. But for anything beyond this, the season was now past. The supreme disposer of all, against whose inscrutable counsels it is vain as well as impious to murmur, did not permit him to enter on the execution of the task which he meditated. I think the supreme disposer here is a reference to God. It was resolved, therefore, by one of his friends, after much hesitation and under a very painful responsibility, to make such an attempt as he could at supplying the void, especially because the insufficiency of our resources for the continuance of the war was understood to have been the principal objection urged against the two former letters on the proposals for peace. In performing with reverential diffidence this duty of friendship, care has been taken not to attribute to Mr. Burke any sentiment which is not most explicitly known, from repeated conversations and from much correspondence, to have been decidedly entertained by that illustrious man. One passage of nearly 3 pages, containing a censure of our defensive system, is borrowed from a private letter, which he began to dictate, with an intention of comprising in it the short result of his opinions, but which he afterwards abandoned when, a little time before his death, his health appeared in some degree to amend, and he hoped that Providence might have spared him at least to complete the larger public letter, which he then proposed to resume. In the preface to the former edition of this letter, a fourth was mentioned as being in possession of Mr. Burke's friends. It was in fact announced by the author himself in the conclusion of the second, which it was then designed to follow. He intended, he said, to proceed next on the question of the facilities possessed by the French Republic from the internal state of other nations, and particularly of this, for obtaining her ends, and, as his notions were controverted, to take notice of what, in that way, had been recommended to him. The vehicle which he had chosen for this part of his plan was an answer to a pamphlet which was supposed to come from high authority and was circulated by ministers with great industry at the time of its appearance in October 1795. Immediately previous to that session of Parliament, when His Majesty for the first time declared that the appearance of any disposition in the enemy to negotiate for general peace should not fail to be met with an earnest desire to give it the fullest and speediest effect. In truth, the answer, which is full of spirit and vivacity, was written the latter end of the same year, but was laid aside when the question assumed a more serious aspect from the commencement of an actual negotiation, which gave rise to the series of printed letters. Afterwards, he began to rewrite it, with a view of accommodating it to his new purpose. The greater part, however, still remained in its original state, and several heroes of the Revolution, I believe that's speaking of the American Revolution, but that could be the French Revolution actually, who are there celebrated, have in the interval passed off the public stage. A greater liberty of insertion and alteration than his friends on consideration have thought allowable would be necessary to adapt it to that place in the series for which it was ultimately designed by the author. This piece, therefore addressed, as the title originally stood, to his noble friend, Earl Fitzwilliam, will be given the first in the supplemental volumes which will be hereafter added to complete this edition of the author's works. The tracts, most of them in manuscript, which have been already selected as fit for this purpose, will probably furnish 4 or 5 volumes more, to be printed uniformly with this edition. The principal piece is entitled An Essay Towards an Abridgment of the English History, and reaches from the earliest period down to the conclusion of the reign of King John. It is written with much depth of antiquarian research, directed by the mind of an intelligent statesman. This alone, as far as can be conjectured, will form more than one volume. Another entire volume also, at least, will be filled with his letters to public men on public affairs, especially those of France. This supplement will be sent to the press without delay. Mr. Burke's more familiar correspondence will be reserved, as authorities to accompany a narrative of his life, which will conclude the whole. The period during which he flourished was one of the most memorable of our annals. It comprehended the acquisition of one empire in the East, the loss of another in the West, and the total subversion of the ancient system of Europe by the French Revolution. So it must have been the French Revolution. With all which events, the history of his life is necessarily intimately connected, as indeed it also is much more than is generally known, with the state of literature and the elegant arts. Such a subject of biography cannot be dismissed with a slight and rapid touch, nor can it be treated in a manner worthy of it from the information, however authentic and extensive, which the industry of any one man may have accumulated. Many important communications have been received, but some materials which relate to the pursuits of his early years, and which are known to be in existence, have been hitherto kept back, notwithstanding repeated inquiries and applications. It is therefore once more earnestly requested that all persons who call themselves the friends or admirers of the late Edmund Burke will have the goodness to transmit without delay any notices of that, or of any other kind, which may happen to be in their possession, or within their reach, to Messrs. Rovington's, respect and kindness to his memory, which will be thankfully acknowledged by those friends to whom, in dying, he committed the sacred trust of his reputation. Okay, and now the advertisement to the present edition. A new edition of the works of Mr. Burke having been called for by the public, the opportunity has been taken to make some slight changes. It is hoped for the better. A different distribution of the contents, while it has made the volumes more nearly equal in their respective bulk, has at the same time been fortunately found to produce a more methodical arrangement of the whole. The first volume contains those literary and philosophical works by which Mr. Burke was known previous to the commencement of his public life as a statesman, and the political pieces which were written by him between the time of his first becoming connected with the Marquis of Rockingham and his being chosen member for Bristol. In the second are comprehended all his speeches and pamphlets from his first arrival at Bristol as a candidate in the year 1774 to his farewell address from the hustings of that city in the year 1780, and also what he himself published relative to the affairs of India. The remaining two comprise his works since the French Revolution, with the exception of the letter to Lord Kenmare on the penal laws against Irish Catholics, which was probably inserted where it stands from its relation to the subject of the letter addressed by him, at a later period, to Sir Hercules Langrish. With the same exception, too, strict regard has been paid to chronological order, which in the last edition was in some instances broken to insert pieces that were not discovered till it was too late to introduce them in their proper places. In the appendix to the speech on the Nabob of Arcot's debts, the references were found to be confused, and in many places erroneous. This probably had arisen from the circumstance that a larger and differently constructed appendix seems to have been originally designed by Mr. Burke, which, however, he afterwards abridged and altered, while the speech and the notes upon it remained as they were. The text and the documents that support it have throughout been accommodated to each other. The orthography has been in many cases altered, and an attempt made to reduce it to some certain standard. The rule laid down for the discharge of this task was that whenever Mr. Burke could be perceived to have been uniform in his mode of spelling, that was considered as decisive. But where he varied, and as he was in the habit of writing by dictation and leaving to others the superintendence of the press, he was peculiarly liable of variations of this sort. The best received authorities were directed to be followed. The reader, it is trusted, will find this object too much disregarded in modern books, has here been kept in view throughout. The quotations which are interspersed throughout the works of Mr. Burke, and which were frequently made by him from memory, have been generally compared with the original authors. Several mistakes in printing, of one word for another, by which the sense was either perverted or obscured, are now rectified. 2 or 3 small insertions have also been made from a quarto copy corrected by Mr. Burke himself. From the same source something more has been drawn in the shape of notes, to which are subscribed his initials. Of this number is the explanation of that celebrated phrase, "the swinish multitude," an explanation which was uniformly given by him to his friends in conversation on the subject. But another note will probably interest the reader still more, as being strongly expressive of that parental affection which forms so amiable a feature in the character of Mr. Burke. It is in Reflections on the Revolution in France, Volume 3, where he points out a considerable passage as having been supplied by his lost son. Several other parts, possibly amounting altogether to a page or thereabout, were indicated in the same manner, but as they in general consist of single sentences, and as the meaning of the mark by which they were distinguished was not actually expressed, it has not been thought necessary to notice them particularly. Okay, and I will stop there, and in the next episode, A Vindication of Natural Society, or a view of the miseries and evils arising to mankind from every species of artificial society, in a letter to Lord by a late noble writer, 1756, Volume 1. The preface in the next episode.